when he was involved in working in domestic policy at the White House. I told you all this earlier. He was involved in the ADA. Now he's a Fox News analyst, so he's on Fox all the time. He's a columnist. So, Jim Pinkerton, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Again, I certainly count myself along with Jonathan as people who would do whatever Jennifer asked. It would always be to the good, it would always be important, and always be rewarding. And so thank you all for listening to me. I realize I'm speaking last, and I won't be nearly as dynamic as Jonathan, so you can sort of ease into your nap. I won't be offended. I've seen it before. Unfortunately I was late for Congress sessions. There's actually a fire on Rayburn here just a couple hours ago. I had to walk off for a while. I guess we're okay. This room with all the ventilation, I mean, this will be the first to go. But I'm sure he gave he obviously is very involved in this issue, both politically and personally, as I'm sure he shared with you. So I don't think there's much I can add to that. I will say this, that what Jonathan said about activity versus accomplishment, that's a good one. Believe me, this whole town is full of lawyers and lobbyists and everybody else who could spend a lot of money and have a good show, and nothing happens. And oddly enough, that's kind of good for business because next year they're at it again. So something to be aware of. But as I think about these issues, and I've been involved and I'm deaf in one ear, and I've been involved in these issues, peripherally, both in the White House Domestic Policy Office under President Reagan and then President Bush 41. So I'm reasonably familiar with them, not as I should be, but nonetheless, it's come back to one point about how Washington, and for that matter, I guess the country largely thinks of this, and that is compassion is what economists call a superior good. Okay? You can look it up, you can Google it later. Superior goods are those things where the willingness to consume that good or deliver that good rises with income. Okay? So when you get richer, you buy more yachts and gold coins and whatever, real estate, island mansions. The contrast is inferior good. Okay? Inferior goods are those things that you buy less of as your income rises. Potatoes, dog food. If you're eating yourself. Beans. So superior good. To be cool about it. And it's an economist. Again, what you're up against here, and you'll see it. There's not a single thing that moves in this town that doesn't somebody immediately say, "Well, what's your CBO score? What's it cost? 10 years, 5 years, whatever it is." And you can argue. That is the metric by which this town operates on anything budgetary. Okay. Now, if it's something that they, like, a 9/11 or something, then they kind of waive it and just ignore it and you spend what you spend. But for the most part, if you're trying to just move legislation through the Congress, it's a CBO issue. And the CBO issue is sort of, again, you can look it up, what the budget plans, including the Obama administration's budget plans, for the future on discretionary spending, it's down as a percentage of GDP over the next 30 years or so like that. And I attribute that in large measure to hard times in the country. The country is just feeling less generous. I worked in the ADA is a great example of a piece of legislation that came at the end of an economic boom. President Bush, who I was fortunate enough to work for, campaigned in 1988, said, "I want a kinder, gentler nation. I want to be," it was very clear. I was involved in the campaign. We wanted to kind of take sand off some of the edges of the perceived hard edges of Reaganism and be more kind and gentler. And so one of the things that President Bush talked more about education, he talked about points of light, and the ADA was a big part of it. But it was clear that, look, the stock market had gone from 1,000 when Reagan was elected to 3,000 when Bush was elected, and the people were feeling good. The real GDP of the country had expanded by a third during those 8 years. So of course, we're going to spend the money to do all the things that the ADA accomplished. And Bush 41 had more than a little bit of noblesse oblige in him, and that, to be admired and a good thing. But if we think about these issues continually going forward, you see President Obama is a liberal, I think, and he's just not turning the spigot the way I think a lot of supporters thought he would. And I think the Congress was divided on this issue. I think Nate Silver, who's the the big prognosticator for the New York Times, the 538.com, who was the one who called all along. He said, look, Obama was going to win in 2012. He just said, I think yesterday, the Republicans were more likely to win the Senate in 14. That's a world we're all going to be living in. And so I think the compassion issue is going to be a tough sell. Now, the other model in the disability rights effort, I think, has been civil rights. Okay, so first is compassion, then there's civil rights. Like I was involved in ADA. I remember working in domestic policy. The IDEA from 1975 was a big deal in our world, and I'm certainly keeping up with as best I can with these things. But the civil rights model has a challenge to it, and that is it's litigation driven. Okay, your heroes tend to be lawyers, and you sue, and you get consent decrees, and so on. And then somebody at the Manhattan Institute, for example, in New York, figures out that 25% of the budget of the New York City public schools goes to disabled children, and it's an enormous number. And the libertarians and the Cato Institute types and the Manhattan Institute, they chew it up and say, listen, all our money is being spent on this, as opposed to that, as opposed to tax cuts, as opposed to whatever it would be. And you're now into a very difficult, challenging territory where, again, Pete Sessions will come here and say what he said, and I'm sorry I missed it, but across town at the Cato Institute, they're saying, look, the whole thing is just waste, fraud, and abuse. The whole thing is just a pork machine for trial lawyers. And we don't dare take on people head on. They don't want to face a group like yours, so they won't invite you over, and they'll just simply say, listen, our plan is the Paul Ryan budget, which is essentially zeroes out discretionary spending 40 years from now. And so don't blame us, we're just doing what the budget says. It's just all CBO scores. It's a way around of dealing with this. Now, you can still litigate and sue at the state and local level, and then it's just sort of, it's you versus the NFIB and the Chamber of Commerce and whoever else, and it's just a fight. And so the third category is, so if one is compassion, the other is civil rights. There's a third element which I think has been sort of lost in our political culture, and Jennifer mentioned the cure strategy. The cure strategy is technological solutions. I think just something about our politics. I was born in 1958, so I'm definitely in the dozen friends category as opposed to the 1,000 small f friends. When I was a kid, it was sort of a sue. We're going to the moon, we're in Star Trek, we're going to go to Mars, we're going to do all this stuff, we're going to have flying cars. And some of that stuff on the internet level happened, but at the macro level of public investment, none of it happened. It's all kind of disappeared. It's sort of gone the other way. And I think that has sort of affected the ability of this town, people here, policymakers, to say, listen, among the options we have, we can raise taxes, we can increase spending, or we can solve the problem with some technological fix. I think that has sort of been lost to the conversation. I think that is a huge deficit in our thinking. And the example that I come to mind with is polio. In 1938, President Roosevelt created the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which is sort of a nerdy name. And it was in a different world where the White House would sort of perceptually be endorsing this charity, and it was to work on the polio vaccine. And the public service announcements of the era said, send your dime to President Roosevelt, and we'll work on polio. And the comedian Eddie Cantor sort of heard that and said, yeah, a dime to President Roosevelt. I get it, March of Dimes. Much catchier, and it was a 17-year effort from 1938 to actually 1955. In 1954, Jonas Salk, who just by random thought, the centennial of his birth is next year, kind of worth keeping in mind, went to President Eisenhower and said, I think I've got this polio vaccine thing figured. And President Eisenhower said, well, okay. Of course, got to test it on people, and so by sort of essentially executive fiat, the president said, okay, every 7-year-old in the country, maybe you remember, is now America's polio pioneer. They didn't ask you, they just said, here's your shot.
I know.
And 1.7 million schools, it hurt, 1.7 million school children were a couple of kids got sick. There was, just nothing's perfect in this world. However, on April 12, 1955, which was actually the 10-year anniversary of President Roosevelt's death, the FDA declared the polio vaccine to be both safe and effective, those magic words. And the world changed. Again, Philip Roth, the novelist, has a novel in the last year or two called Nemesis. It's about the polio epidemics of Newark, New Jersey, as he was growing up in the 30s and 40s. And that is a case where technology, medicine, concerted effort, including public-private, private charity, a heavy public participation from the government on the polio pioneers thing, and unbelievable popular support. People knew exactly who Jonas Salk was, and they were hoping that he was working at the University of Pittsburgh, hoping that he could get this thing figured out and we wouldn't have to worry about polio anymore. And it all worked. And basically nobody in this country, and nobody who's born in this country, has to worry about polio anymore. It was just a remarkable success. Children walked. The Milken Institute out in Los Angeles did a study, and they recall this study of economists back in 1950 calculating that if present trends continued with the polio epidemic still raging across the country as it was, by the year 2000, 50 years ahead, the U.S. would be spending $100 billion on wheelchairs, iron lungs, braces, and so on. And of course, $100 billion adjusted for inflation would be more like $1 trillion. And instead, we're spending $0. That's pretty good. And nobody has polio. And again, the CBO approach would have said, well, wait a second, $100 billion, trillion, way too much. Let's cut it by 20%. So we'd have, have to wait in line for your brace or your wheelchair or your iron lung. That would really be serious. It's just a different way of thinking about the problem. And I would submit to you that the disability community has to think seriously about whether it wants to associate itself with the technological solutions to these problems, the medical solutions, the lack of a better word, the cure. Okay? Heart disease in America is 3/4 more survivable than it was in 1950. That's not only good news for people whose grandparents were dying of heart attacks, it's also good news for the budget. It's also good news for all of us just walking around in terms of, it used to be pretty common. People in the 50s have a heart attack, they'd retire. They effectively became disabled. And now heart attack is sort of a maintenance thing. In your 50s, 60s, that's for sure. These things are possible, not completely possible, but I would even go further and say that if you can do this, you've created an industry on your hands. And that is, the medicines that you create that work to solve problems are not only valuable to your country, they're valuable to the world. And so we had answers to these things. Look, it's already the case that big hospitals in America are major economic development engines for New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Atlanta and Chicago and where else. And not just big hospitals, these sort of small hospitals. NPR had a story a couple years ago about Miami Baptist Hospital, which is not the most well-known hospital in the world, has a huge medical tourism from the Caribbean. People coming there to spend millions. Now that's a lot of jobs. Again, when you're now associating yourself with a positive sum economic relationship. Look, we're going to do this, we're going to cure this, we're going to create an industry out of this, people from around the world are going to come, we're going to help them all. All of a sudden you go from saying, needing Jonathan to help explain how you tug money out of some member of Congress to saying, listen, we're part of an economic development engine here that you all need. And we're going to work on the FDA, and we're going to work against the trial-lawyers, not with the trial-lawyers. It'll be a little bit a paradigm shift, I'm sure, for a lot of groups to think that, in other words, the groups that are, it's just a fact, for example, that in the current system today, the number of new medical drugs approved by the FDA down 40% in the last 20 years. Number of new medical devices down 40% in the last 20 years. Number of antibiotics, for what it's worth, down 80%. Venture capital in the field, somewhere between a third and 3/4, depending on how you measure it. It's having an effect on, again, if you have a disease that was dealt with a long time ago, no problem. If you have any kind of neuromuscular disease, Alzheimer's, you're just completely out of luck, and there's not much prospect of it getting better. So in that sense, Alzheimer's sort of illustrates another point, and that is, in many ways, the disability community is the leading edge for an aging society. If you think about what happens when you get old, you lose your eyesight goes, your hearing goes, your brain goes, your mobility goes, and so on. To the extent that as people with disabilities think about their problems and their issues and their challenges, they realize all the rest of us, and I am deaf in one ear, but I consider myself pretty healthy. I'm under no illusions about what the next half century holds for me and so on, and I'll spend a lot of money. If it's available, there's a Chinese proverb, dig the well before you get thirsty. Okay? There's millionaires and billionaires going to their graves with, you can look it up in the paper, whatever industry, issue, field, calling, region you follow. Oh yeah, so-and-so died. Gee whiz, what do you think you would have paid to live an extra 10 years? A lot. It just doesn't exist. It's just one of those things where it's like, in Washington, it's like a lot of places, you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu and you say, well, gee, I don't like anything here at all. Believe me, if it's a nice enough restaurant, you say, listen, I want a peanut butter sandwich. I want spaghetti and meatballs. They'll get it for you. They have to go across the street to the Safeway. They'll get it and bring it back to you and sell it to you at 4,000% markup. But they'll give it to you. And so that part of the challenge is to say, listen, it is true that the same Congressional Budget Office has sort of circumscribed all our thinking into, can we get this much more of an appropriation from X, Y, and Z? And things that Washington can't, there aren't any scientists and technologists around here. You can go to this entire building, and you go to the cubicle of a Democrat or Republican, and you'll see political figures and literary figures and whoever figures. You're not going to see scientists. Same thing with the think tanks. It's just this town is lawyers, economists, bureaucrats. It's not Dean Kamen. Dean Kamen, a lot of you probably know, lives up in New Hampshire, has I think 445 patents. He had a great article in Popular Science in 2009 about, listen, we should be creating this entire industry of mobility and helping people and walking legs and so on and so on. And it was in Popular Science. It wasn't in the Wall Street Journal. It should have been. It wasn't in the New York Times. It was tucked away in this ghetto of technology, whereas Washington and New York and sort of the chatter classes in general are reading about, should the deficit be bigger, should taxes be lower, should free trade this or globalism that. There just isn't space in their heads to think about how do you make a better wheelchair? How do you get brain waves to move objects for people who are paralyzed? Or how do you clone eyes? How do you cure all? It just isn't really part of the discussion. And again, you can look through any article in the Post or the Times or the Journal or any other paper, any other big paper you can think of. I always do this for fun. Just scan the article or F2 on your computer for a word search. Look for the words research, medicine, cures. You won't see them. It's just not part of the discussion. But if it's not part of the discussion, then you're, again, up in this difficult, essentially zero-sum, I want you to be more charitable, or I want you to feel more charitable, and so your money goes from your pocket to help my group and so on. Zero-sum. I think the litigation and civil rights thing, essentially sort of zero-sum to slightly negative sum, because the trial lawyers are making a lot of money. Again, the Manhattan Institute's Wally Olson has a whole thing called overlawyer.com that every Republican who follows litigation issues is aware of. And there's probably 10 articles a day about somebody getting rich on some lawsuit. And it's just not the way Republicans think, on how these things ought to get settled. They just don't. And so I think that the alternative is technology. And I mean just technology like nerd stuff, although that's kind of exciting and cool. I mean economic growth. The economist Angus Madison calculated that the standard of living, the per capita standard of living in Europe rose 11,000% from 1600 to 2000. Okay, you can see a pretty good welfare state emerging when people are 114 times richer than they were before. And you can see all sorts of stuff being invented. You see the difference between paupers crawling along the ground to being being treated in sanitariums. It's a huge difference. As we think now about Moore's law, as we think now about quantum computing, we think about 3D printing. I kind of keep track of this stuff. Just the other day, there was they've 3D printed out of sort of semi-human tissue a new esophagus. Anybody with acid reflux knows how important that is. They're going to 3D print everything if we want them to. Again, they got to worry about the trial lawyers. They got to worry about the FDA. They got to worry about iPad, the part of the Affordable Care Act coming and so on like that. So I think the challenge is to say, listen, what we, broadly speaking, are going to show you, the political community, is not only do we want equal rights, not only want to be emancipated and so on, we also are customers. And not just customers for votes. We'll vote for absolutely the politicians we like. So, but we're also customers for buying this stuff, okay? I mean, again, I don't have the numbers for all these healthcare, but I do know one as an example. Alzheimer's is a $20 trillion hit on the U.S. economy between now and 2050. 20 trillion with a T, okay? Right, it's a couple hundred billion now, rising to 1.2 trillion as people like me get old. And now, at one level, it's just a shame and a tragedy. Everybody's dealt with an Alzheimer's or dementia, relative, or friend, or patient. It's a pretty horrifying experience. It's also $1.2 trillion going for what now we have nothing to treat it with. Okay? The FDA says there's exactly zero. You can try your crossword puzzles, eat broccoli, whatever you want. There's no medical evidence that does a single bit of good. That's 1.2 trillion coming out of somewhere else. Back to zero-sum propositions here. So we got to think about that. Think also about if we could get a handle on Alzheimer's. It's also pretty likely we know a lot more about brains and nervous systems and so on. And a lot of new Jonas Salks will be, on the loose, and who knows what they come up with. So that's my argument, and that is, again, compassion, civil rights, transformation. I think they're all important. I think that the benefit of transformation is it hooks you to a value proposition that every economist can see. You're going to make money doing this. You got a lot of customers. We're all going to, if you make this thing, we're all going to buy it. Now, it might not be their own personal money, but the government buying it. Look, believe me, Merck and Pfizer and Medtronic, they don't care public or private. They just want to know that if they make 10 million widgets that help people walk or help people have a better life, somebody will buy them. It becomes more like arms contractors in World War II. How much President Roosevelt called up Boeing and said, "How much do you want for 30,000 bombers that can fly to Berlin and back?" And Boeing gave him a price, and the next thing you know, the B-17 was born. That's sort of a different vision of this. I think that actually be pretty attractive to the private sector. I think that you all could be part of saying, "Well, we got a pretty good customer base here, a demand for this to happen." And along the way, I'll just, there's a famous quote from Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, 2001, and Childhood's End and so on, who said, "Look, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And that's sort of the lesson for all of us here, is we all want for all of us to be fully able to participate in our social life and the economy and the culture of this country and so on. And I do think that history shows that technology can be a big part of it. Thank you.
You brought up three things. The compassion, civil rights as examples, and transformation. So one of the questions is, what do we do about transformation? In other words, what you're saying is what Joe Coates and some of the other futurists have been saying related to public policy. And that is, over a 20-year period, let's say, 20-year period, the public policy starts to come up, let's say, after 15 years. I'm making up some numbers here just to get you the concept. A graph would go like this. It's being talked about a little bit, and all of a sudden it hits the newspapers more in stories, and then all of a sudden it gets into the public policy issue, the mind of the people, etc., politicians, and then it takes maybe another 5 years to get into an actual policy itself or a law. So it seems to me that if that model's correct, and basically you were kind of describing that kind of model, that it would be up to us, people here and other places, to, it's going to be a couple more years before things change. But what we have to do is start the transformation today, and that is write some of the things that the other speakers said, write articles, do other kinds of things like just to make people aware. And finally, the politicians will become aware of the need, and the Congressional Budget Office, as you're referring to, will also become aware that they should start to support these kinds of things when Congress asks them to prepare budget studies and things of that sort. And then maybe we'll have some results. But you gotta start. And you
Right, you gotta start.
now.
I think you described what's called the S-curve.
Yes,
Very-
correct.
very
That's
nice.
exactly what I'm talking about.
Again, I think a hook, again, I think I mentioned the centennial of Jonas Salk's birth is next year.
Right.
The 60th anniversary of the polio vaccine itself is 2015. Those are two hooks. There's also a letter, I didn't have the president's mind to bring it, but if you Google President Roosevelt, November 17th, 1944, letter to the Pentagon Science and Research and Technology Director Vannevar Bush, that's V-A-N-N-E-V-A-R Bush. You'll see Roosevelt saying, dear Dr. Bush, now that the World War II is almost ended, we've spent this enormous effort. I would like you now to review the prospects we have for taking the same kind of scientific and technological mobilization that we had during the war and apply it to peacetime. And I said, for example, he said, disease, more Americans are dying of a handful of diseases than were being killed in the war. That's an example. It's a hell of a letter, and I think it actually, and then Vannevar Bush, Van Bush, they called him, published a report in July of 1945 called, after President Roosevelt died, called Endless Frontier, and it's a long discussion about how to take all this science and technology that have been piled up by the military, by the government, and put it to use. I think, now, it seems to me that, this is where I very much associate myself with the sort of Jennifer, Jonathan, AIPAC model of working the political system. I think I would just be curious, of all the members of Congress and senators, there's really only one member of Congress that I know who talks about what I would call the cure strategy. And that's a fellow named Rob Andrews. He's a Democrat from New Jersey, represents sort of Camden and sort of Cherry Hill and sort of suburban Philadelphia on the New Jersey side. And he had an article that he published in the Wall Street Journal last fall in which he said, we're at our best as a country when we set big goals. I talked about the moon. He said, John Kennedy in 1961 didn't say, I want to increase NASA's budget by 84%. He said, we're going to go to the moon. And if people agreed, they didn't have to agree, but if they did, then everything else fell into place. Rob's point, and this is what I'm trying to address your point here, is you do have to articulate a goal. You do have to find one politician. Now, Rob Andrews, I'm Republican, Rob's Democrat.
People can see and understand.
If people can see, and then look, let the politician do the work. It's their job. Look, if you say, listen, we have a vision of nobody suffering from X, Y, and Z down the road somewhere. If you can get, that's not the same as paying for it. We'll pay for it in the meantime. Nobody's saying, we're not going to be a compassionate country. We're just going to say it's actually more compassionate if every child can walk.
Sorry to jump in. Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Before we go too far down? I just want to recommend, because you have laid out such a fantastic framework, and I think you're in a lot of environments where you can present this, so I'm excited about that. The traction that I think your logic will have within this community may be strongest with the technology strategy as presented over and above the cure strategy. That is with acquired disability in the form of even early onset Alzheimer's, right? We can, maybe as a populace, we can kind of generally agree that this is an unfortunate occurrence, right? That someone may grieve their imagined future life. But in the disability community broadly, we don't have agreement about eradication as a goal. So in the autism community, there's been huge struggle in the difference between the grief of a family who encounters autism as a surprise in their child and the belief in some adults who have autism that they are who they are, and that they're not on a path to eradicate that difference. So I hear a real trigger there, as you call it, the care strategy, that I think is too bad, because I've used a wheelchair since I was a power wheelchair, since I was 5. When I bought my first wheelchair, and I think really to the other speaker's point, I imagine my parents really did buy it. You know, there were two to choose from. So I was 5, so it was 3 times too wide for me. Now, 30 years later, there've barely been 2 advancements. The thing tilts back, it goes 2 miles an hour faster. 30 years, those are the changes. Also now they have front wheel drive, so that's 3 changes structurally to a huge piece of technology. So I love the imperative of your point and the impact that it can make on the lives of people with disabilities broadly, including those with cognitive disabilities, including those with autism. But when you dip over to cure, you're really in a different territory.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm aware of that distinction, and we probably all heard of it too, the posters in Seattle about, you know, wipeout, and so they had to take them down because of exactly this issue. No, I'm abundantly aware of this issue, and I guess my argument would be, you got to confront it. You got to decide. In other words, if the economic political model is that we want the society as a whole to not to put too fine a point, to pay for it, well, then you're just up against. I mean, I think every word that Jonathan said about how to work Congress should be chiseled in stone. Okay, he's brilliant. He knows exactly what he's doing. Exactly what he's doing. You got to understand, he's probably giving that pitch 2 or 3 times a week to somebody somewhere. Something about their group too, about Joseph Kony and whatever, APAC and whatever other issues he's involved in. There are a lot of other smart people who also understand how to work this town. And that's why it's hard, because there's about 20,000 trade associations and activist groups working this thing. Let me tell you how Rob Andrews, I mentioned before, he addresses this. His key thing is wounded warriors. Now, I don't think any wounded warrior says, I'm really happy in my current situation. And so Rob has said, let's lead the way on this issue with them. They have a full moral claim on our resources and everything we can do. And so let's help them put them back together. And then I guess at that point it's sort of up to everybody else to decide how they want to, you and everybody else, how do you want to react or absorb to this new technology? I'm sure Rob would say, listen, we're not going to make anybody do it, but we will pay for it, because remember, it's not just compassion. Once you get yourself plugged into that industrial revolution, technological transformation model, it gets dirt cheap. And frankly, that's the beauty of this stuff. Is cell phones, remember what they were like 20 years ago, or 25 years, they were bricks. Now they're cheap as dirt. I mean, that's the story of technology. It's a story of factories. It's a story of mass production. And again, I think everything that you want to consume, you want to see mass produced, because it gets cheap. They can basically give it away. The marginal cost of the new stuff, the first Apple iPhone was in the billions, in what it really cost them. And I'm sure now, you go to the Apple Store now, this one that doesn't look right, oh fine, we'll give you one, I don't care. Because the unit cost of just handing them out to make the customer happy is got to be in a couple dollars range. So listen, I think Jennifer is kind of giving me the hook here. But listen, I'm happy to speak to you. I know it's getting late and it's getting hot. I'm hot, and you've been here all day. Oh, it's hot out there. So you got nothing to look forward to. Thank you all very much.
Very interesting thought. Don't go yet. I just want to spend a couple moments saying this is the first time we've done this in the disability community. We're an organization that is a grand total of about 3 weeks old. So I'm sure that we made mistakes, or I'm sure that there's something that we didn't think of. So I think you all have my email. I really, really want ideas on how we could do this better. I really want to hear what worked that you'd like to see more of. I'd really like to see how you think we can make a bigger difference. And also, I just want to thank again that we have 6 incredible people that are, I think it's 6, but we have David, we have Lauren, we have Kenny, and we have Hannah, somewhere right there is Hannah, and Hillary, and also Daphna, that are all and Matthew, that are all volunteering for us. And we're looking for other volunteers. Now, 3 of them are students, and they're about to go back to school. So this great burst of energy that we've had in putting this together, 3 of them are students that are going back to school. So we're looking for new fellows to come in and to join us. We're very lucky because the Autism Society is hosting us. And so we have wonderful office space in Bethesda, 3 blocks away from a metro where the elevator sometimes works, but not often enough. So we really want to get to know everybody in this community and to learn lessons. Now, in terms of events coming up, I'm going to call on Jill, who doesn't know I'm calling on her, because she has a fabulous event coming up at the Chamber of Commerce very shortly. So if you could just tell us the event that's coming up that you're doing on disability employment, I'd be very appreciative.
Thank you. So Thursday, July 25th, next Thursday, the USBLN, in partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is bringing business together to talk about corporate disability best practices. So you will have the opportunity to hear from folks like Carolyn Brooks, who's the Chief Diversity Officer of OfficeMax, as well as many other corporations, as well as Senator Harkin, as well as Congresswoman McMorris Rogers. For registration information, you can go to our website at usbln.org, and registration closes on Friday, this Friday. So the agenda's there, the registration, and thank you.
And it's only $35, if I'm not mistaken. It's really cheap, and they might give you more than a donut and a hot room with no potty breaks. So anyway, we're looking forward very much to getting to know you all better. I want to thank Jim and all the other speakers that spoke. I want to thank the volunteers that have been so helpful. And again, we're the new kids on the block, and we have a lot to learn. So send us your constructive criticism and your ideas and your feedback, and we just want to do better and have a chance to work with you, because I think we all agree that it's time to empower people with disabilities to be able to achieve the American dream. So thank you very much.
Just in the spirit of, like, David, you have something on Thursday too, don't you?
So Thursday is
Yes.
also the National Council on Independent Living's annual march to the Capitol. So there will be hundreds of people with disabilities in Washington. At the when they get to the Capitol, they have their annual rally. I know a number of members of Congress and the Senate will be speaking. And then at the end of that, we'll be having a media event for the Disability Treaty. And that announcement is being formalized as we speak, and will get blasted out to all the networks within the next 24 hours, I believe. So watch for that in your inboxes. Make sure you get it.
Well, did anybody else have an announcement that I omitted of another event coming up that we should know about?
And then later in the afternoon is the annual USICD, or USID annual meeting, and that's on the USICD or disabilitytreaty.org website, and you can find out the announcement there. The other thing I just wanted to inject is this week I know a lot of members of the community are mourning the passing of Michael Winter. I just wanted to inject his name just as someone that's inspired me a lot. Michael worked under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and to some folks he was our community's transportation advocate, in that he told a bus that wouldn't let him on in the late 60s, well then the bus isn't moving. And he put his feet on the first step from his wheelchair, and that bus didn't move, and it started a movement that we can all be thankful for today. So think of Michael Winter this week as well. Thank you, Jim.
Anything else? Anybody else? Kenny?
Tonight, I got already signed up for it, but I'm not going because I have to work out because I've been sitting down all day. But there's a DC accessibility dinner at the Martin Luther King Library tonight.
Oh,
Okay. Anything else that anyone wanted to announce? Thank you all again very much for coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.